ruling. Okay, this is lecture 6, take 2.
In this session, we'll discuss how terms like appropriate technology or intermediate technology emerged in the developmental discourse. We'll discuss the ways in which these technologies differed from the way development planners had thought of technology in early developmental theory, as new nations then embarked on the three-pronged modernization, rapid industrialization, establishment of Western-style liberal democracy, and social modernization to turn colonial subjects, particularly the poor, into rational actors. As I mentioned in the last lecture, by the late 1960s, the early developmental paradigm had come under severe criticism from the left and the right of the ideological spectrum. Somewhere in the middle of this ideological duality, there emerged a powerful critique which borrowed ideas from both the left and the right, but also injected some new ideas about development as if people mattered, which was the subtitle of Fritz Schumacher's famous book, Small is Beautiful. This book laid out the critique from the middle in great detail. Development from below, bottom-up development, grassroots development, these are some of the phrases used at the time to describe the alternative priorities set forth by the critique from the middle. Implicit in these phrases were assumptions about what was wrong with the early developmental model, now disparagingly called the trickle-down approach. Trickle-down development had failed, the critics argued, because the top institutions created at the top to foster development had become its greatest hindrance. The primary target in this critique was the state, like the critique from the left and the right, but other institutions at the top were blamed too. For example, market actors, such as multinational corporations and large private firms, were criticized for failing to create employment, even though they received large state subsidies. Established political parties were criticized for seeking power by manipulating the poor and colluding with the army and the elites. Trade unions were chastised for protecting the interests of the poor and the labor aristocracy, meaning a small percentage of laborers with formal jobs who had been co-opted into the system. As an alternative, these critics proposed a new paradigm, meaning a different constellation of actors, issues, values, and modes of action. In contrast to the top-down model's central objective of industrialization and economic growth, the bottom-up approach advocated meeting the basic needs of the poor in both rural and urban areas. Instead of the large-scale state-administered infrastructure projects, the new approach advocated small-scale bottom-up projects that provided immediate income-earning opportunities for the poor. Typically, the new projects involved small groups of poor families who lacked assets or a steady source of income. These families were provided subsidized credit for starting small enterprises. Such enterprises range from basket making and similar non-agricultural activities in rural areas to production of low-cost wage goods and cheap services in urban areas. These activities were expected to generate income, employment, savings, and investment at the bottom directly, without waiting for income to trickle down from the top through the market hierarchy. The bottom-up approach proposed a different model of politics as well. In contrast to the focus on procedural democracy in the early developmental model, there was a new emphasis on substantive democracy. The difference between procedural and substantive democracy was the following. In procedural democracy, the emphasis is on formal democratic process with established political parties and elections. In contrast, substantive democracy focuses on whether the citizens feel empowered, whether they can mobilize without the support of any political party, and how citizens can put pressure on the government institutions by going beyond the electoral process, say, through social movements. The bottom-up approach focused on substantive democracy because the proponents believed that the formal political process was not meeting the needs of the poor. These institutions were riddled with corruption and were often working with the army, which had come to power in many nations by the beginning of the 1970s. You may recall that we touched on this point in an earlier lecture. To summarize, development from below proposed a new emphasis, both economically on small enterprises and politically on grassroots organizations like non-governmental organizations, which are apolitical organizations. These organizations were supposed to be closer to the poor and more accountable to them, and more efficient in delivering services than governmental bureaucracies. The proponents asserted that even though self-governance and self-sufficiency of the poor were the key objectives, that non-governmental organizations and community groups could play catalytic roles in assisting the poor to develop their small enterprises and help them to create solidarity groups which could function as autonomous cells in a substantive democratic process. Let us now discuss from a technological angle how bottom-up development differed from the big push model of the early development paradigm. In contrast to the big push model of import substitution industries aided by technology transfer from abroad, the bottom-up model emphasized that what was needed were technologies that were more appropriate to meet the basic needs of the poor. In contrast to the early focus on economic growth, export promotion, and import substitution, the new focus was to be on the fulfillment of the basic needs of the poor through small-scale economic activities which could benefit from the use of appropriate technologies, meaning technologies that were cheap, easy to repair, used local resources, and whose working was transparent to the poor. This line of argument regarding appropriate technologies rested on a few key assumptions. First, that the poor were already using such technologies to meet their needs because neither the market nor the state were able to provide for their needs. As John Turner said when he remarked on self-construction of housing by the poor, and here I quote, "Look how much the poor have produced with so little, while how little the government has produced with so much." This statement captured the anti-government mood of the time, and you may recall that such anti-government rhetoric was popular with criticism from both the left and the right of the ideological spectrum. A second assumption of the appropriate technology movement was that small-scale production was more efficient than large-scale production, which had been justified earlier by the economy of scale argument. In this, the bottom-up proponents borrowed from neoclassical economists of the time who were extremely critical of government intervention to create the big push. Small scale meant not only small economic enterprises by the poor, it also meant a focus away from national level efforts at infrastructure creation to community level efforts which could be more beneficial to improve the overall quality of life of the poor. The new emphasis moved away from the earlier assumption on the creation of capital goods by large-scale public investments in the production of heavy technologies, which could then be used to produce large amounts of steel, concrete, and other basic materials necessary for modernization of industries. The bottom-up proponents argued that the big push created large, inefficient organizations, which, unlike the small firms, relied on imported materials, capital-intensive technologies, and catered mostly either for the export market or for the rich domestic consumers. Third, unlike the left and the right critics who believed in modernization, this new model of thought questioned the basic premise of the modernization paradigm. In this, they valorized the way the poor people were ingeniously managing their lives and proposed that the government should learn from the poor about how to use resources efficiently. These critics believed that poor people's way of working, which in the modern paradigm was considered superstitious, irrational, and unproductive, was actually based on an economy of affection, meaning they relied on reciprocity, on innovative ways of using locally available natural resources. Instead of disparaging the technology used by the poor for productive activities as inefficient, these critics proposed that such technologies be studied and be built upon to produce appropriate technologies. In terms of assessment, in contrast to economists who use econometric modeling, these critiques relied on case studies that demonstrated the coping strategies of the poor in the face of failure of both the market and the state to give them opportunities for a decent life.